Whispers in the Sand. The dark truth behind the desert's hunge. Hook. Sure. Here's an engaging hook in English to draw viewers into the video. Ever wondered what happens when you venture too close to the truth? What if the desert itself had a secret? A hunger that could consume not just your body, but your very soul. Join us as we unravel the chilling story of a woman lost to the sands and discover the shocking twist that will leave you questioning everything. Stick around until the end. You won't believe the truth waiting for you. This should keep your viewers hooked and eager to watch till the end. The wind howled through the dunes, carrying with it the scent of salt and dust. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the empty desert. Emily stood still, her breath quickening, each exhale dissipating into the cool night air. She could feel it, the presence. It was not just the wind, not just the desolate silence. Something else was watching. The soft whisper of sand shifting beneath her boots felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. She looked around, her eyes darting across the barren landscape. Nothing. Only the endless stretch of desert, the black sky, and the distant stars. But the feeling, the sensation, it was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. She had come to this place for answers. But now, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth. Emily had heard the stories, the legends that whispered about this cursed land, of a place where the past never truly left, where the dead still walked. She had laughed at them. But now, standing alone in the vast emptiness, she wasn't so sure. A faint sound echoed, not the wind, a footstep. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Her mind was playing tricks. But then another step, closer this time. She swallowed hard, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't just the wind. Someone or something was here with her. The hairs on her neck stood on end as she strained her ears, listening intently. There, a voice, barely a whisper, yet unmistakable. Get out. While you can. Her body stiffened. That voice. She recognized it. It couldn't be, but it was. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned in a panic, her heart pounding in her ears. The moonlight illuminated a figure in the distance. Tall, cloaked in shadows. Its eyes gleamed, dark and hollow. Emily froze, unable to move. The figure took a step toward her, and then another. Each step felt like a hammering drumbeat, heavy with inevitability. Her thoughts raced. She had to run. She turned on her heels, but the sand beneath her feet seemed to shift, pulling her down. She stumbled, fell. Her hands scraped against the rough earth. She looked up. The figure was closer now, its presence suffocating. No matter how hard she tried to scramble to her feet, the weight of the air seemed to hold her down. The whispers in the sand grew louder. They weren't just warnings anymore. They were promises. The whispers twisted, curling into words that felt like ice against her skin. You're too late. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps. She pushed herself up, but the ground seemed to reject her. Each movement was slower, heavier, as though the earth itself was trying to trap her. She looked back. The figure was mere feet away now. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face was obscured by darkness. But there was something about the way it moved, something unnatural. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, hovering just above the sand. Emily's body shook with cold. A voice echoed in her mind, a warning she could not ignore. Don't look at it, don't look at its eyes. But she couldn't stop herself. Her gaze was drawn to it, to those empty, gleaming eyes. They reflected nothing but a hollow, endless void. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. She could hear the whispers now, every word clear. You've uncovered the truth, but not the whole truth. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. Emily stumbled backward, unable to tear her eyes from the figure. Then it spoke again, its voice low, rasping like dry leaves. "You should have stayed away. This place, it never lets go." Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The desert was dead silent. Emily was paralyzed, her legs refusing to move. She could feel the heat of the figure's presence seeping into her skin. It reached out. A hand, no, a claw, emerged from the shadows, stretching toward her. Its fingers were long and jagged, like brittle bone. Before she could scream, it was upon her. The air around her shimmered, as if reality itself was breaking apart. In that instant, Emily understood. The truth was not what she had come here for. The truth was far worse, and it would never let her leave. The claw brushed against her skin, cold as death. Her entire body went numb. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in every corner of her mind. "You are ours now." The figure leaned closer, its breath hot and foul. Emily could taste the dust in the air, feel it settling in her lungs. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, constricted. The world around her began to blur, the sand swirling into a vortex of shadows. Her vision faded, and for a moment, everything was black. Then, suddenly, she was no longer standing. Her body was weightless, floating in an endless, dark expanse. The sand was gone, replaced by cold, smooth stone beneath her. She tried to move, to fight, but it was like her limbs no longer belonged to her. A voice spoke, low and distant, but clear. "You thought you could escape the past." The words felt like daggers, piercing through her mind. "You thought you could uncover the truth." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm she couldn't escape. The voice continued, its tone growing darker. "But the truth has always been here, waiting for you." She wanted to scream again, to call out for help, but her mouth wouldn't obey. Instead, she was drawn forward, her feet moving on their own. The shadows parted, revealing a vast, ancient hall, a place long forgotten, sealed away by time itself. It was cold here, so cold it stung her skin, and in the center of the hall she saw them, the bodies, rows upon rows of lifeless figures, all dressed in tattered clothes, their eyes hollow and vacant. They were the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had come here before her. They had sought the truth, too, and now they were part of the desert, part of the darkness. A wave of terror crashed over her. She understood now. She was not alone, and she would never leave. The figures in the hall stirred, their hollow eyes turning toward her, all at once. Their faces were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over bones. Their mouths hung open, as if they were trying to speak, but no sound came. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Emily's stomach churned. She tried to turn and run, but her feet were frozen in place. It felt like the stone beneath her had become a part of her. She was trapped. The whispers intensified, swirling around her like a storm. "One more truth, Emily. One more." The voice was not the figures anymore. It came from everywhere, from the very walls, the stones, the dust. She could hear it, feel it, in every part of her being. She tried to breathe, but her chest was tight, suffocating. The figures began to move slowly, dragging themselves across the cold stone floor. Their eyes never left her, their gaze unblinking. She wanted to close her eyes, to look away, but she couldn't. The truth was coming, and she had to see it. The ground beneath her trembled once more, violently now. The walls cracked, and a deep rumbling filled the air. From the darkness ahead, a shape emerged. A figure taller than the rest, cloaked in shadows. It stepped forward, its form wavering in and out of sight, like smoke. Emily's heart skipped. She knew that shape. It was the one that had followed her out in the desert, the one that had first whispered to her. The truth, the voice now said, was not just buried here. It was buried in her. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at her. You are the final piece. The one who unlocks everything. Her breath caught in her throat. The final piece? She shook her head, her mind racing, trying to understand. But there was no understanding, not here, not now. The ground trembled again, louder, more forceful this time. The air thickened, closing in around her. Her vision blurred, the world spinning. And then, like a burst of light, everything went dark. For a moment, there was nothing but blackness. No sound, no movement, just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. Then, slowly, the darkness began to recede. Emily's eyes fluttered open. She was back in the desert. The sand beneath her was warm, the sky still ink-black above. She could feel the wind again, though it felt different. The presence was gone. The whispers had stopped. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it all. But something inside her felt wrong. Something had changed. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid, no longer the dry, crackling earth she had known. It felt soft, like flesh. The sand seemed to pulse. She stumbled back, heart racing, as she realized the truth. The desert had swallowed her. It had been waiting for her, and it wasn't finished yet. Her breath caught in her throat. Behind her, the distant silhouette of the figure appeared once more, framed against the pale light of the moon. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a shadow. It was real. Closer now, its shape twisted and warped, like something caught between worlds. It moved toward her, its steps slow but inevitable. The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping with each breath she took. Emily wanted to run, but the ground was alive, pulling her back with every step. Her legs felt heavy, as if they were sinking into the sand. She turned and ran anyway. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she bolted into the night. The moon seemed to stretch out before her, an endless, unreachable expanse. But the sound of footsteps followed her, close, always close. No matter how fast she ran, no matter how hard she tried to escape, it was there, just behind her, relentless. She dared not look back, knowing what she would see. Her heart pounded, her chest tight with fear. And then, just when she thought she couldn't run anymore, the sand gave way beneath her, and she fell. She plunged into darkness, the cold, shifting sand swallowing her whole. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the sensation of falling. Faster, deeper. Her body twisted, and her breath caught in her throat. Then, with a sharp thud, she landed hard on something solid. The world spun around her as she gasped for air, her body aching from the fall. She struggled to push herself up, but the ground felt wrong. Her hands sank into it, as though it were alive. A chill ran up her spine. The air here was thick, with a strange, unnatural weight. Her vision cleared, and she looked around. She was no longer in the desert. This place, this underground chamber, was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls were lined with black stone, slick and cold, covered in strange, jagged carvings. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decay. And there, in the center of the chamber, was a large stone altar. It was surrounded by a circle of burned-out torches, their faint glow casting long, twisted shadows across the room. Something about the altar drew her in, an undeniable pull that she couldn't resist. Her feet moved almost of their own accord toward it. And then she saw them, figures still as statues, lined up along the edges of the room. More of the lost souls. Their eyes were hollow, empty. Their bodies shriveled, like mummified corpses, their hands reaching out toward the altar. She stopped in her tracks. They were waiting for something, for her. As she gazed at them, the whispers returned, louder now, sharper. You've come too far. Her body went rigid, as the voice grew inside her mind, louder than ever. You were never meant to leave. The stone altar before her began to shift, groaning like it had been awakened from a long slumber. A crack appeared down its center, and from it a dark, misty figure began to rise. It was the same figure, the one from the desert, but now it was not cloaked in shadow. Now it was fully revealed. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across its skull, eyes glowing like molten silver. It stepped forward, and the ground trembled beneath its feet. Its gaze locked onto Emily, unblinking, unwavering. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a chorus of agonized screams. You were the one. The figure's voice was raspy, like the scraping of metal on stone. The key to set us free? The stone beneath Emily's feet began to crack open, revealing something far darker beneath it. Something ancient, something evil. And the figure reached toward her, its fingers long and twisted, the air around her growing thicker. Closer, closer still, and Emily knew. She had walked into a trap from the very beginning, and now there would be no escape. The figure's hand hovered inches from her face, its icy presence pressing against her skin. Emily's heart slammed in her chest, her breath shallow. The whispers surged, drowning out everything else, a maddening cacophony of voices, pleading and screaming. Her legs were frozen, unwilling to move. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, brighter still, blinding, burning with unnatural light. You are the last piece, it rasped, its voice an unbearable hiss in her ears. Emily's body trembled with terror. The weight of the truth hit her with crushing force. She wasn't just here because she sought answers. She had been brought here, drawn in by something older than the land itself. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from hers. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw something, someone, standing behind it. A flash of another face. A face she knew. It was her own. No, it couldn't be. But as the figure opened its mouth to speak again, a sudden, sharp pain erupted in Emily's chest. Her eyes went wide with shock. The pain was unbearable, searing through her body like fire. Her hand instinctively went to her chest, but there was nothing there, nothing she could touch. It was inside her. The altar, no, the room itself was alive, pulsing with energy, feeding on her. And then the figure whispered one final word. Embrace. The ground beneath her cracked open wider, a dark, swirling vortex forming at its center. From within, an overwhelming force surged, pulling her in. Emily screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The walls closed in, the shadows growing thicker, suffocating. She tried to fight, tried to claw her way out, but the air was heavy, thick with a power she couldn't understand. And the figure, its eyes never leaving hers, began to fade into the darkness, its final words echoing in her mind. Now, you are one of us. Her body lurched forward, dragged into the abyss, swallowed by the ancient, hungry dark. Everything went silent, and Emily was no more. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. Nothing, no sound, no feeling, no air. And then, slowly, like a fading memory, she became aware of something. The cold, the dampness, the weightlessness. She opened her eyes, if she had eyes still. She didn't know. All she felt was an endless void pressing in on her, surrounding her, suffocating her. But there was something else, too. A presence, a pressure. It was watching. It was waiting. Emily's mind screamed, but her body wouldn't respond. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were scattered, lost in the emptiness, like dust in the wind. And then, with a jolt, the void split. Light broke through, sharp and blinding. She gasped, if she could still gasp. Her senses flooded back. Her vision cleared. But what she saw, the desert, The endless dunes stretched out before her, and she was standing in the middle of it. But something was wrong. Everything felt off. The sand beneath her feet wasn't just sand. It was alive. It shifted with a will of its own, swirling around her, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down. She looked around, trying to move, but her legs were heavy. Her body was sluggish, disconnected, as though it no longer belonged to her. And then she heard it, a voice, a whisper. "Welcome back." It came from everywhere. It came from the desert itself. The sand trembled. The wind howled. The stars overhead flickered, distorted, like broken glass. "Embrace what you are now," the voice crooned. Emily's heart, or what was left of it, stilled in terror. She didn't understand. What was she? She glanced down at her hands. They were wrong, pale, tattered. She felt a strange, gnawing hunger inside her, deeper than anything she had ever known. A craving. The sand beneath her feet began to pull harder, faster. It wasn't just the sand. It was the desert. It was alive. It had claimed her, and now it was taking her back. The world around her twisted again, folding in on itself. Her vision blurred once more as the ground seemed to split, revealing an endless dark chasm beneath her. Her body screamed. Her mind screamed. But there was no escaping it now. She was part of this place, part of its curse. And the desert had no intention of letting her go. The chasm beneath her grew wider, darker, pulling at the very core of her being. Emily's body trembled, her fingers curling into the shifting sand. She could feel it, deep within her, the pull, the call of something ancient and insatiable. It wasn't just the desert anymore. It was her body, her soul, all entwined with the land, with the darkness that had been waiting. The whispers were louder now, no longer fragmented voices, but a single, unified roar. "You belong to us." The wind picked up again, swirling violently around her, the air thick with the scent of rot and decay. The sky overhead, once of velvet black, began to change, twisting into shades of red, deep maroon and violet, like a bleeding wound in the heavens. The stars flickered and blinked out one by one. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the chasm, growing louder, like the growl of some monstrous creature beneath the earth. Emily's breath was shallow. Her heart, what was left of it, beat erratically. She didn't want to look down, but she couldn't help it. The darkness was stretching, bubbling upward from the chasm, like a thick, black smoke that rose to consume the world. It wrapped around her ankles, pulling at her legs with cold, unyielding force. She screamed, but her voice was lost in the wind. The desert wasn't just pulling her down. It was pulling her in, making her part of its curse. And in the distance, in the twisted sky, she saw them. The figures, the lost souls she had seen in the chamber beneath the earth. They were rising from the sand, emerging from the cracks in the ground. Their hollow eyes locked onto hers. They reached for her, their fingers elongated and skeletal. "Join us." They moaned in unison, their voices hollow, as though they had been waiting for this moment for eternity. The figures began to surround her, their forms indistinct, shifting like shadows in the wind. Emily couldn't move. She was trapped. The ground trembled again, this time violently. She could feel the earth beneath her starting to crack, the weight of something enormous pushing from below. Something ancient, something that had been waiting dormant for millennia. And then, the first of the figures reached out, touching her shoulder. The moment its hand made contact, a jolt of energy shot through her. It wasn't like pain. It was worse. It was like her very essence was being ripped away, like the land was claiming her, absorbing her into its depths. And she realized then, with a sickening clarity, she was no longer human, not fully, not anymore. The desert had claimed her, and now she was one of them. A whisper in the sand, a shadow in the dark, trapped in the endless, suffocating emptiness of this cursed land. Her soul would never leave, and the whispers would never stop. The figures closed in around her, their presence suffocating, pressing in from every direction. Emily could feel them, feel their cold, deathless touch against her skin, their eyes boring into her soul. They were part of the desert. They were its eternal servants. And now so was she. Her mind screamed, but her body was no longer hers to control. The sand shifted, swirling around her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Her feet no longer touched the earth. She was floating weightless, as though her body had dissolved into the very air around her. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through her bones. The desert's pulse, the heartbeat of something ancient, something hungry. It spoke to her, not with words, but with a presence. It was calling her, pulling her into its eternal, empty fold. She had uncovered the truth, but the truth was far worse than she had ever imagined. The desert had no end. The souls lost here were never freed. They were trapped, eternally wandering, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. And now Emily would join them. She felt the weight of it pressing on her chest, her very being slowly becoming one with the land. Her thoughts were fading, replaced with a strange, unyielding sense of acceptance. The figures around her shifted, their forms flickering, like flames in the wind. They were not human anymore. They were dust, shadows, and whispers. And now so was she. The darkness enveloped her entirely. The chasm beneath her was gone, replaced by an endless sea of sand. Time lost all meaning. She no longer knew whether it was moments or centuries that passed. But she was aware of one thing. The whispers, the calls, the endless chorus of voices now carried her name. She was part of them now, and she would never leave. The desert had claimed her, and it would never let go. Emily's essence, her very being, stretched out into the infinite dark. The voices around her were growing stronger, more insistent. They were her now, and she was theirs. The sands churned as if alive with the memories of countless others who had walked the same path. Her thoughts drifted, tangled with those of the lost souls, their suffering becoming hers. She felt their pain, their despair, as if it were her own heart breaking in 1,000 pieces. The weight of eternity pressed on her, suffocating, yet familiar. She was no longer Emily, not in the way she had once been. She was something else, something bound to the land, to the desert that never ceased. She could still feel the pull of the world she had left behind, but it was distant, a fading echo. Her body, no longer a body, shifted through the shifting sands, weightless, untethered. She had no name here, no identity. She was the wind. She was the sand. She was the whispers in the night, the footsteps that left no trace. The desert was alive, and she was its part now. She could sense the others, the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had come before her. And somewhere within the depths of the dark, a shape moved, a figure, just like the one that had first drawn her into this world. It watched her from afar, its eyes gleaming, knowing. It wasn't a figure of shadow anymore. It was her. The realization came in a flash of horror. She had become what she feared the most. The desert had turned her into it. She had become one of the figures, one of the shadows, one of the lost. The truth of this place was unbearable. There was no escape. There was no going back. The desert was the end, and Emily had crossed it, never to return. Her screams, once fierce and desperate, were now mere whispers, carried away by the wind. Her face was not hers anymore. It was the face of the desert, empty, hollow. The endless wind swept her away, and she was nothing but a shadow lost in the sand, trapped in a land that devoured everything. Forever did I and the shifting sands, Emily's form drifted like a specter. She had no weight, no substance. The desert had taken everything, her memories, her flesh, her identity, leaving behind only a whisper. The wind carried that whisper across the dunes, mingling with the voices of the others. All around her, she could feel them, the souls, the lost ones who had wandered too close to the truth. They surrounded her not with touch, but with presence. Their cold, hollow eyes stared out from the darkness, watching, waiting. They were her now, and she was them. Time had no meaning in this place. The sands stretched forever, an endless sea of desolation. Every grain a memory of someone who had once been alive, once human, once full of hope. But now they were all part of the desert. The ancient force that had claimed them, that had claimed her, was patient. It fed on the lost. It grew stronger with every soul it consumed. Emily could feel its hunger gnawing at her, deep in her core. It was relentless. It would never stop. She thought of the world she had come from, of the warmth of the sun, of the laughter of loved ones. But those memories slipped away like sand through her fingers. The desert erased them one by one. What remained was only emptiness, only the eternal stillness of the dunes. She could hear the whispers again, louder now. They were speaking in unison, their voices echoing in her mind. Asterisk, join us. Become one with the endless sands. The desert never forgets. The desert never lets go. Asterisk. Emily tried to fight it, to cling to some piece of herself. But the more she struggled, the more the desert consumed her. Her thoughts were fractured, broken, scattered like the sand itself. She could still remember the feeling of fear, of desperation, but it was distant now, like a fading dream. She could feel the pull of the abyss, drawing her in deeper, urging her to forget, to surrender completely. But something flickered within her, a spark, however faint, a memory that refused to die. It was the sound of her own voice, a distant echo, a cry for help. But no one was there to hear it. She was alone. She was lost. And yet, as she drifted further into the abyss, one thought lingered in her fading mind. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. The desert was full of others who, like her, had once sought the truth, and now they all whispered in the wind. Forever the whispers swirled around her, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if they had been waiting for her to truly understand. She was one of them now, a part of the desert's endless hunger. The pull grew stronger, tugging at what was left of her soul. But even as the sands pressed in, something stirred within her, a faint flicker of resistance. It was small, fleeting, like a forgotten memory that refused to fade. Emily felt a shift, a strange tug in her chest. It was a force, subtle yet undeniable, trying to break free from the suffocating grip of the desert. But the desert didn't let go so easily. It twisted and cracked around her, its grip tightening, feeding off that spark of resistance, smothering it. The sand beneath her began to shift violently, swirling in a frenzy. The figures that surrounded her began to move, not just in the shadows, but physically, dragging themselves through the shifting earth, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Do you think you can escape?" The voice, cold and mocking, came from all sides. It was the voice of the desert, the ancient force that had devoured so many before her. "Once you've crossed into this world, there is no return." But Emily didn't hear it fully, not anymore. Her mind was fading, but that spark, that one remaining piece of her, was still there, flickering in the dark. She held onto it, grasped it as tightly as she could, even as the desert sought to extinguish it. In the depths of her soul, She knew one thing. She would not become another lost shadow. Not entirely. Not if she could help it. The sand churned beneath her, pulling at her like an endless tide. But Emily fought. Not with her body, no, there was nothing left of that. She fought with her thoughts, with her fading will, with the last vestiges of what it meant to be human. A burst of light exploded in her chest. Not like before, but different. It was a force, a sharp spark of defiance. For the briefest of moments, she felt her body again, her arms, her legs. She felt the weight of the air around her, the cold of the night sky. And she screamed, a sound that was hers, a sound that came from deep inside her, from the core of who she was. The wind howled, the sands recoiled. The desert shrieked in anger, in fear. The figures stopped. For a moment, everything stood still, and Emily felt it. The desert's grip loosened, just for a second. It was enough. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed, reaching out, asterisk grasping asterisk, for something, anything, that would bring her back. And then she broke free. The sand, the voices, the figures, all of it faded. The desert's clutches loosened as her form lifted from the ground, carried by that flickering spark of resistance. The world around her collapsed into darkness, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, Emily felt lightness. She had escaped, but at what cost? The last remnants of the desert, its whispers, its hunger, clung to her, buried deep within her soul. She was free, but she would never be the same. That Emily's mind was still clouded, her body trembling as if it had been split in two. She felt like she had emerged from a deep, suffocating void, gasping for air that wasn't there. But the world around her was different now. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet. The wind had stopped. The sand, once alive with movement, lay still as glass. The air tasted foreign, clean, but empty. She blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in the desert, but she wasn't in the world she had known either. The sky above her was dark, a void with no stars, no moon, no sign of life. It was as though she had been thrust into a limbo, a space between worlds where time didn't exist. She looked around, but saw nothing familiar, only an endless stretch of barren, lifeless land, a wasteland. It was as if the desert had swallowed everything, leaving only emptiness behind. A cold shiver ran through her as she realized she hadn't escaped at all. The desert had let go of her, yes, but it had not released its hold completely. It was with her, inside her, its hunger, its whispers, its endless craving. She could still feel it, gnawing at the edges of her mind. The figures she had once been surrounded by, their hollow eyes now lingering in the dark corners of her thoughts. And the desert itself, it was waiting. It had claimed her in more ways than one. Her chest tightened, a cold pressure pushing against her. Was this what freedom felt like? To be free but hollow? To escape one nightmare only to fall into another? Her legs shook as she took a slow step forward, the weight of her thoughts heavy on her shoulders. It was impossible to know how much time had passed, how long she had been wandering this desolate place. But as she moved, she heard something, a whisper. At first, it was faint, so faint she thought it might have been her imagination. But then it grew louder, closer. "You're never free," the voice said, rasping through the still air. Emily stopped. Her heart slammed in her chest. It was the same voice she had heard in the desert, the one that had promised her there was no escape. She whirled around, eyes darting through the darkness, but there was nothing. The land was as empty as it had been before. Yet the voice, it was inside her now, vibrating in her very bones. "You can never escape the desert," it whispered again. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The truth was crushing. The desert had not just consumed her. It had become part of her, woven into her very essence. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was the desert itself. Her body may have left the sand, but the hunger, the endless void, remained. It would never let go. The winds began to stir once again, faint at first, but growing stronger, colder. The whispers around her swelled into a chorus, a maddening symphony of voices. And in the distance, just beyond her reach, she saw it. The silhouette of the figure from the desert, its glowing eyes fixed on her. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was her. She had become it, and she would never escape the desert again. The figure in the distance moved closer, its form shifting and distorting in the dim, endless wasteland. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, but there was nowhere to run. The land around her was still, unnervingly so. Every grain of sand, every gust of wind was silent, waiting, anticipating. And then the figure was before her. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a reflection. Her own face, twisted and pale, eyes hollow and glowing like the figure's. She tried to move, to speak, but her body felt frozen. The desert had taken her, yes, but now it had something worse in store. It was making her a part of itself. The figure spoke, its voice her voice, the words trembling in her mind. "You can never outrun the truth," it whispered, low and eerie. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out. The figure's hands reached forward, and she could feel its cold touch on her skin, as if it was pulling the very essence from her. The pull was stronger now, deeper than she had ever felt before. It was no longer just a hunger from the desert. It was her hunger. The void inside her seemed to stretch wider, colder. She tried to scream, but the desert was already inside her, choking the words, swallowing them whole. "You belong to the desert now," the figure said, its voice melding with the whispers around her, growing louder, multiplying. She could feel the weight of it, the weight of all the lost souls trapped within the sands. They were inside her, their thoughts, their fears, their memories, all tangled with her own. The wind howled once again, but this time it felt different. It felt like her voice. It felt like their voices, their endless cries for release. And in that moment, Emily understood. There was no escape. The desert wasn't just a place. It was a being, a vast, hungry entity that consumed everything, left nothing behind. It didn't just take bodies, it took souls. And now, she was part of it. She could feel it, the weight of eternity pressing down on her shoulders. The memories of the lost, the tortured, the forgotten, swirling inside her like a storm. And she was the storm. She could see herself now, truly see herself, standing before the endless expanse of sand. Her reflection was no longer human. She was the desert, its whispers, its hunger, its endless need. And the truth settled deep into her bones. The desert would never release her, and in time, she would become it entirely. The endless cycle would continue, forever. Emily stood, her body a hollow echo of what it once was, surrounded by the crushing weight of eternity. She had become the desert, not in the way she had imagined, but in a deeper, more insidious sense. She wasn't just lost in it. She was it now. Her thoughts, once her own, were now intertwined with the voices of the lost souls, their pain, their regrets, their cries. The wind howled again, but this time it wasn't just the desert speaking. It was her. Her voice mingled with all those who had fallen before her. "Come closer," the voices whispered. "Join us in the endless sand. There is no escape." The words didn't come from her mouth. They came from the depths of her being, from the very air around her. The figure, her asterisk figure, stood silently, its glowing eyes still fixed on her, unwavering. "You see now," it said softly, a cold smile creeping across its face. You are one with the land. The desert's hunger is your hunger. Its thirst is your thirst. Emily's mind struggled against the truth that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. But it was futile. The desert had taken everything, and now it was taking her soul. The endless sands around her began to shift once again, the ground cracking open, revealing the chasm beneath, deep and dark. It beckoned to her. It pulled at her, just as it had pulled the others before her. "Do you remember the first time you stepped into the desert?" the figure asked, its voice reverberating inside her mind. "You thought you could understand. You thought you could escape. But you've always been a part of it. Always." Her vision blurred as the desert swirled around her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as the pull from the chasm grew stronger. Her body began to feel weightless, as if the very essence of her was being pulled toward the dark depths. But then, just as she thought she would be consumed, she felt something. A flicker of resistance, small but defiant. A memory, the spark of who she once was. And in that brief moment, she screamed. Not a scream of fear, but a scream of rage. She fought. Fought against the pull. Fought against the whispering. Fought against the desert itself. Her soul, even as it cracked under the weight of the desert's hunger, refused to be fully consumed. Her scream echoed through the endless dunes, and for a moment, the desert paused. The wind stilled. The earth ceased its shifting. The voices fell silent, but only for a heartbeat. Then, the desert roared back to life, thrashing violently around her, trying to swallow her whole. It was too much, too powerful, and as she felt herself being drawn deeper into the abyss, she realized the truth she had long denied. There was no fighting it. There was no escape. The desert had already won. It always had. And she was just another whisper lost in the sands. The darkness swallowed her whole, the world around her crumbling into nothingness. Her body, what was left of it, dissolved into the vast, suffocating void of the desert. The pull of the chasm was unrelenting. The weight of eternity pressed against her chest, pushing all thoughts from her mind. The voices, her voice, rushed past her, a torrent of whispers and wails, becoming indistinguishable from one another. They were one now, and she was one with them. For a fleeting moment, there was a flash of clarity, a moment where she could almost remember who she had been before all this. Her name, the warmth of sunlight, the feeling of wind on her skin. But it was a distant memory, fading faster than the breath in her lungs. The desert had no place for memories for life. It had only hunger, only a vast, empty need that could never be quenched. Emily's body, her soul, all of it was being drawn deeper into the heart of the desert's endless chasm. And there, in the deep, dark pit of nothingness, the desert's grip tightened around her. She could feel it, something ancient, something monstrous stirring beneath the sand, ready to consume her entirely. The desert was no longer just a place. It was a being, a consciousness, and she was a part of it now. The figure, once so distant, was now beside her, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. "You were always meant to be here," it whispered, its voice echoing inside her skull. "You were never truly free. The desert is in your blood, in your bones. It will never let you go." Emily wanted to scream, wanted to resist, but she was powerless. She had been absorbed into the very land she once feared, and now there was no escaping. The winds rose again, a chorus of howling voices surrounding her. The sands began to shift violently, pulling her deeper into the chasm's core. And as she descended, Emily's mind, her memories, her very soul, began to dissolve into the darkness. She was no longer Emily. She was the desert, endless, hungry, silent, and she would remain there, lost to time, waiting to claim the next soul that dared to seek the truth of the sands. As Emily's form descended into the heart of the desert, the weight of the world, or what was left of it, pressed down on her. The vast chasm yawned beneath her, an endless pit of darkness where no light could reach. She felt herself pulled deeper into it, not just physically, but mentally, her thoughts fading like a distant memory. The voices, once distant whispers, now surrounded her, their presence suffocating, smothering any remnants of who she once was. The desert had taken everything but the hunger, and now that hunger was hers to bear. "You were always meant for this," the figure beside her whispered again. Its voice was no longer separate from her own. It was a part of her now, an extension of the desert's eternal longing. Emily couldn't escape the truth anymore. There was no before and no after. There was only the endless void, the eternal pull, the gnawing hunger that consumed all who dared enter. The very fabric of her soul had been woven into the desert's being, her essence tangled with the lost souls of those who had come before her. She felt them now, each one, each whisper, each mournful cry, coursing through her like blood in her veins. They were her, and she was them. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing brighter. "You see now," it said, its tone both gentle and chilling. "You were never meant to escape. You were meant to join us." The chasm trembled, and the ground beneath her seemed to open further, stretching out into an abyss where time had no meaning. She felt herself drifting, floating, not in space, but in the endlessness of the desert's grip. There was no sound, no air, only the endless, ever-present hunger. And then, in one final, overwhelming moment, she realized the desert was not a place. It was a living entity devouring, growing, consuming everything. And now, as it had taken her, it would wait. It would wait until another soul came, another curious fool seeking the truth, only to be swallowed whole like the rest. Emily had become part of the desert's hunger, a whisper lost to time. And the desert would never stop. It would never let go. It would only wait forever. The sands stretched infinitely before her, the endless horizon blurring in the distance. Emily's body was no longer hers, no longer tangible. She was a whisper, drifting through the air like the dust that once surrounded her. Her thoughts had long since fragmented, slipping through the cracks of her fading consciousness. But something remained, a flicker of awareness, a trace of her humanity, clinging to her as tightly as it could before being swallowed by the desert's insatiable hunger. But now, even that was beginning to fade. The desert had done its work. She was one with it, woven into its very fabric, part of its endless cycle. But something deep within her, perhaps the last vestige of herself, understood. This wasn't an end. It was simply a transition. The desert had consumed her, yes, but it had not taken her entirely. In the deepest, most hollow places of her being, she felt the pulse of something new, something she could not explain. The whispering voices of the lost souls no longer suffocated her. They had become her, and in return, she had become them. Her form, once bound to the earth, was now as free as the wind, as endless as the sands. Emily, in this moment, understood the desert's truth. It was not just a force of destruction, but of renewal. It consumed to create, devoured to birth new life in its wake. The desert, in all its silence, in all its hunger, was not empty. It was full of stories, of souls, of whispers carried on the wind. Her voice, no longer hers alone, joined that chorus, becoming one with the eternal song of the desert. And in that final moment, Emily felt peace. Not the peace of escape, but the peace of belonging. She had found her place, not in the world she once knew, but in the vastness of the desert's timeless expanse. She was part of the land now, part of its endless rhythm, its eternal cycle. And as the winds rose and the sand swirled around her, Emily understood. She had not been lost. She had been found, and the desert would never forget her.